They built 28 condos on my land, so I took them down, brick by brick. Jake Lawson, a civil engineer turned land developer, visits his late father's property, 20 acres of unused land on the edge of a fancy HOA community. He plans to restore it as a memorial park. But when he arrives, he finds foundations being laid, construction signs up, and HOA flags waving. They were building condos on my father's land, and they didn't even bother to check who owned it. Jake confronts the HOA president, Diane Walsh, a sharp-tongued woman in heels who insists the land was legally purchased. She waves around paperwork that doesn't have Jake's signature. The hum of the fluorescent lights filled the county recorder's office, that dull, bureaucratic drone that made time feel slower. Rows of metal cabinets stood like sentinels of truth, each drawer holding decades of secrets and signatures. Jake walked in, calm and focused. He'd been here 1,000 times before with his father, filing deeds and checking boundary lines. But today was different. Today, he wasn't just a landowner, he was a man hunting for the truth. The clerk, a gray-haired woman named Denise, looked up from her screen. "Can I help you, Mr. Callahan?" Jake gave her a polite nod. "Looking for a record on parcel 47B22, should be under Callahan Land Holdings." She typed, fingers clacking like distant gunfire. After a moment, her brow furrowed. "That parcel's still active under your family name. There's no record of transfer." Jake leaned in slightly. "No sale, no deed filed." Denise shook her head. "Not a thing, but—" She hesitated, turning the screen slightly. "Someone filed a survey last year claiming ownership under the HOA's name. It's marked verified by a board member." Jake's eyes narrowed. "Mind printing me a copy?" A few minutes later, the printer spat out a set of papers, stamped, signed, and very obviously falsified. Jake recognized the signature. Roger Telford, HOA treasurer. The same man who'd once bragged about bringing order to the neighborhood. Jake exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening. They really thought no one would check. Denise gave him a sympathetic look. "You want me to report this to the county attorney?" He shook his head, folding the papers neatly and sliding them into his jacket pocket. "No need. I'll handle it myself." He turned to leave but paused at the door. The sunlight from the window cut across his face, half in shadow. He gave a small, calm smile, the kind that carried more promise than threat. "Guess I'll be needing a demolition permit," he said quietly. Denise blinked. "Excuse me," Jake turned back with a smirk, "for the condos they built on my land." And with that he walked out, the papers tucked under his arm like loaded ammunition. The truth was on his side now, and soon the HOA would realize that records don't lie. The letter was only 3 pages long, but it carried the weight of a wrecking ball, typed in crisp legal formatting, signed by Jake's attorney, and sealed with the emblem of Callahan Land Holdings. The notice was crystal clear. Cease and desist all construction activities immediately. The property located at parcel 47B22 remains under legal ownership of the Callahan estate. Any further development, alteration, or occupation constitutes trespassing, fraud, and willful destruction of private property. Jake sent copies to everyone: the HOA's board, their lawyer, the construction company, and even the local zoning office. He made sure each envelope was certified and tracked. There be no pretending they never got it. Days later, the first response came in the form of laughter. The HOA's attorney, a smug man in an expensive suit named Richard Hale, called Jake directly. His voice oozed confidence, that corporate arrogance polished by years of billable hours. "Mr. Callahan," Hale said with a chuckle, "I've reviewed your so-called notice. Colorful stuff, really. But the HOA acquired that parcel fair and square. Your claim is, well, cute." Jake leaned back in his chair, gazing out the window at the distant half-built condos that now stood like parasites on his father's land. "Cute," Jake repeated softly. "That's one way to describe fraud." Hale laughed again. Listen, son, there's a lot of paperwork in land deals. Mistakes happen, but trust me, you're wasting your time. Those buildings are almost complete. Why don't you take the HOA's offer? We'll name the new park after your family. Call it even. You think I care about a park? Jake asked, his tone ice calm. I think you care about fighting a losing battle. Maybe, Jake said, or maybe I'm just patient. There was a silence that stretched too long. Then Hale hung up with a dismissive snort. Jake smiled to himself. Perfect. For the next few weeks, Jake became a ghost, silent, watching and waiting. He didn't protest. He didn't threaten. He didn't even show up at HOA meetings anymore. The board took it as a victory. Victoria Lang, the HOA president, made sure everyone saw her smiling face in the local paper. She was quoted saying the development was a shining example of community progress. The construction continued. The condos rose higher, drywall and paint replacing the open air where Jake used to watch sunsets with his father. Workers came and went, trucks rumbled down the once quiet road, and every evening the sound of hammers echoed across what was still Callahan land. Jake kept every receipt, every photograph, every update from the county's building department. He even hired a drone operator to document the progress. Each image was time-stamped and stored, irrefutable proof that the HOA had ignored his legal order. And when the condos were finally finished, the ribbon-cutting ceremony became a spectacle. Victoria wore a red suit and oversized sunglasses. She stood behind a podium flanked by gold balloons, beaming for the cameras. The local news covered it, calling the new complex a modern oasis in the heart of the valley. Jake watched from the tree line on the edge of his property, hands in his pockets. He didn't look angry, just observant, like a man watching a trap being baited. As the crowd clapped and champagne corks popped, Victoria sliced through the ribbon with polished scissors. "Welcome to Maple Ridge Condominiums," she declared. Jake turned and walked away. 2 days later, a courier arrived at the HOA office with a thick envelope. Victoria tore it open impatiently, expecting some congratulatory letter from the mayor or a supplier. Instead, she found a second notice, this one far more detailed than the first. It wasn't just a cease and desist anymore. It was a notice of trespass and property reclamation, issued by the county sheriff's department at Jake's request. It included the original land title, the fraudulent survey documents, the notarized statements from the county recorder, and a certified copy of the demolition permit Jake had quietly secured. On the final page, a single line stood out in bold red print. All structures erected upon parcel 47B22 are subject to immediate removal. Victoria's hands trembled. The laughter that once filled HOA meetings vanished. The board members called an emergency session that night. Richard Hale, their once cocky lawyer, looked pale under the fluorescent lights. He shuffled through the documents, sweat beading on his forehead. This can't be right," he stammered. "The county approved our plans, the permits. Were filed under false ownership," Jake's voice interrupted from the doorway. Every head turned. Jake stepped into the meeting room, calm as ever, holding a folder under his arm. "I told you weeks ago to stop building," he said, his gaze locked on Victoria. "You didn't listen." Victoria rose to her feet. "You can't just walk in here and—" "I can," Jake said, cutting her off, "because this is still my land, and you're trespassing." He dropped the folder onto the table. Photos, permits, timestamps, even drone footage spilling across the polished wood like evidence at a trial. "By the way," Jake added almost casually, "the demolition crew's on standby. They'll move in once the county inspector signs off. Shouldn't take long." Hale shot up from his chair. "You wouldn't dare." Jake's eyes hardened. "Try me." For a long moment, no one spoke. Only the hum of the overhead lights filled the silence. Then Jake turned and left, the sound of his boots echoing down the hallway. That night the HOA board sat in stunned silence. Victoria's perfect smile was gone. The condos, their pride and joy, now hung over them like a ticking time bomb. Jake, meanwhile, sat on his porch under a quiet sky. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and looked toward the glowing lights of the new buildings on his land. They were beautiful, symmetrical, modern, expensive. And soon they'd be nothing but rubble. Jake didn't believe in quick revenge. He believed in complete revenge, the kind that left a lesson carved deep enough that no one would dare repeat the mistake. He set his glass down, watching the moonlight shimmer across the rim. "Let them have their celebration," he murmured to himself. "Tomorrow they learn who owns this ground." And with that, Jake leaned back in his chair, the demolition permit tucked safely inside his jacket, a silent promise that the waiting game was over. The morning sun glared off the polished windows of Maple Ridge condominiums, turning the glass into mirrors that reflected the sky, and soon enough, the chaos that was coming. The residents were still moving in. Movers hauled boxes up stairwells. Kids rode bikes along the freshly paved drive. HOA banners fluttered proudly in the breeze, reading "Welcome Home to Maple Ridge." At exactly 8:03 a.m., the rumble began. Engines growled from down the road, deep, mechanical, and unmistakably industrial. Heads turned as a convoy of heavy trucks rolled into view. A low cloud of dust trailed behind them. Bulldozers, excavators, a wrecking crane, and a flatbed carrying portable fencing. And at the front of it, all a black pickup truck, with a magnetic decal reading Callahan Land Holdings. The driver's door opened. Jake Callahan stepped out, hard hat in one hand, a thick folder of papers in the other. He wore a plain gray shirt, jeans, and steel-toe boots, not a businessman today, but a man on a mission. Behind him, two county sheriffs stepped from their cruiser, badges gleaming in the morning light. Their presence alone was enough to silence the growing crowd of confused residents. Jake adjusted his hard hat and started walking toward the front gate. The security guard stammered, Sir, you can't just." Jake handed him a folded document. "Court order," he said flatly. The guard unfolded it, scanning the stamped signatures, the bold legal seals, the county insignia. His face went pale. 1 second," the guard muttered, fumbling for his radio. "Mrs. Lang, you'd better come down here, now." Inside the HOA's glass-walled office, Victoria Lang was in the middle of a meeting when the call came through. "What?" she snapped. "A demolition crew, don't be ridiculous." But as she stepped outside, her confidence evaporated. Across the street, bulldozers idled, their engines humming like beasts in a cage. Workers in orange vests stood ready, glancing toward Jake for instructions. And there he was, calm, unreadable, standing in the shade of the entrance arch that bore the HOA's proud name, Maple Ridge Condominiums. Victoria hurried over, heels clacking on the pavement, with two board members scrambling behind her. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice trembling between outrage and disbelief. Jake turned to face her. His expression didn't change. "Actually," he said evenly, "I own this dirt you're standing on." He handed her a document, the demolition order, signed by a county judge and stamped by the building commission. Victoria skimmed the first few lines, and her face drained of color. "Pursuant to County Code Section 4-19, and confirmed land title ownership of parcel 47B22, authorization is granted to the lawful owner, Mr. Jacob Callahan, for immediate removal of all unauthorized structures." Her hand shook. This must be a mistake. Jake pointed toward the signature line. "Judge Wilcox doesn't make many of those." Behind them, Richard Hale, the HOA's lawyer, came running up, sweating through his suit jacket. Jake, let's be reasonable here. We can work something out. Money isn't an issue." Jake turned slowly. "You think this is about money?" Hale swallowed hard. "Everything's about money." Jake stepped closer until their eyes met. Not this. This is about respect. My father built this land from nothing. You built condos on it like it was trash. You forged surveys. You ignored every warning I gave you." He took a breath, letting the silence hang heavy. "Now you get to watch it all come down." The sheriff stepped forward, unfolding a clipboard. "Orders valid," he confirmed. "Proceed when ready, Mr. Callahan." Victoria's voice cracked. "Utah people live here." Jake nodded toward the sheriff. "Which is why they've got 48 hours to clear out. The county posted notices last night." Her jaw dropped. You had this planned." Jake smiled faintly. "Patience pays off." Hale cursed under his breath. "This isn't over. We'll take you to court, Callahan. We'll appeal this all the way to—" Jake raised a single hand. "Go ahead. But when you do, remember this." He gestured toward the demolition crew, the excavators lining up like soldiers. "Every minute you waste in court is another day your illegal condos sit empty. And every day they sit empty, you pay the fines." The lawyer had no answer. By noon, the property was surrounded by orange fencing. News crews had arrived, their cameras rolling as Jake walked the perimeter with the sheriff. Reporters shouted questions. "Mr. Callahan, is it true the HOA built on stolen land? Are you really tearing down finished homes? What's your message to the residents?" Jake stopped long enough to answer one of them. "My message," he said, glancing back at the condos. "Don't build on something you don't own, because someday the real owner's gonna show up." The cameras flashed. The quote would headline every paper the next morning. That evening, Jake stood near the worksite as the sun dipped low over the hills. The air smelled of dust and oil. He watched as residents carried out furniture, boxes, even potted plants, all under the watchful eyes of county deputies. Some cursed at him, some pleaded, some simply looked heartbroken. Jake didn't gloat, he didn't smile, he just watched in silence. This wasn't joy, it was justice. By nightfall, the property stood empty. The once celebratory banners fluttered weakly in the wind, half torn and faded. The HOA office lights were dark. Jake walked through the silent complex, boots echoing against the concrete walkways. His fingers brushed the brick walls. Fresh paint, new windows, all of it worthless now. He stopped in front of a plaque, mounted near the entrance. "Dedicated to community progress, Maple Ridge HOA, 2025. He stared at it for a long moment, then said quietly, "Progress doesn't start with theft." He turned to his crew. "Tomorrow at sunrise." When dawn came, the sky was streaked with orange and gold. The demolition crew gathered, hard hats on, machinery lined up. Jake stood in front of them with the sheriff beside him. "Let's do this clean," he said. "Start with the clubhouse, work your way out." Engines roared to life. The ground trembled as the first excavator arm swung forward, slamming into the clubhouse wall. The crash echoed across the valley, a thunderous symphony of retribution. Glass shattered, dust billowed, concrete split apart. Within minutes, the proud symbol of the HOA, their meeting hall, their banners, their pride, lay in a heap of twisted metal and broken dreams. Victoria arrived halfway through, standing at the edge of the site in disbelief. The sheriff stopped her at the fence. She screamed over the noise, "You'll regret this, Jake." He didn't look at her. "Already did," he said softly, eyes fixed on the ruins. By the end of the day, the condos that had once gleamed with false promise were nothing but piles of debris. The land was bare again, scarred, yes, but honest. Jake stood alone amid the dust, watching the sunset over the open field that had once been his father's pasture. He pulled a small photo from his wallet, his father standing on the same land decades ago, leaning on a shovel, smiling. Jake looked at it for a moment, then whispered, "It's yours again, Dad." He tucked the photo back, turned to the crew, and gave a single nod. "Good work, boys. Let's clear it all out." The machines rumbled off and the sheriff's cars drove away, the last of the daylight faded. The land was silent, once more just like it had been before the HOA ever touched it. And Jake Callahan, the man they'd mocked, the man they'd underestimated, walked away from the rubble without looking back. Because he didn't need to. The message had been delivered loud and clear. Ownership means everything, and records don't lie. The engine started at sunrise. One by one, the excavators rumbled to life, low, growling machines breathing diesel and vengeance. Their steel arms glistened under the morning light, ready to tear through concrete and pride alike. The demolition site was sealed off now. Police tape fluttered in the breeze, keeping curious neighbors at bay. On the other side, county officials, deputies, and reporters gathered, whispering behind camera lenses. And standing right in the center, calm, composed, unshakable, was Jake Callahan. He held the court order in one hand, its pages rustling softly in the wind. On the header, Superior Court of Maple County, authorization for demolition and reclamation of private land. It was signed, sealed, and irreversible. Jake's father's land, once stolen, now avenged. He gave a single nod. Let's begin. The first excavator moved forward with a deafening roar. Its claw rose high, shadows stretching across the ground, before it came crashing down. Boom! Concrete split apart. The sound echoed through the valley like thunder. Windows burst, debris scattered, and a massive cloud of dust rolled through the air. People screamed, reporters shouted, camera shutters snapped in rapid fire. The once pristine condos, with their new balconies and fresh paint, trembled as the second impact hit. Walls buckled inward. Tiles cracked and shattered. Within minutes, the proud first condo was collapsing like a stack of cards. Jake didn't move, didn't flinch. He just stood there, the wind whipping at his jacket, eyes fixed on the falling structure. To him, it wasn't destruction, it was correction. Up the hill, HOA President Victoria Lang watched in horror. She had arrived late, thinking she could stop the operation with a last-minute injunction, but the judge had already denied it. The paper still trembled in her hand, her lipstick smudged, her composure gone. When the first condo hit the ground, she stumbled backward, gasping as the dust cloud swallowed the sign that once read "Luxury living starts here." A deputy caught her arm as her knees gave out. "Ma'am, you need to stay behind the line," he said. Victoria's voice cracked. "He can't do this, those are homes." The deputy just pointed toward the legal notice posted on the fence. "Court says he can, says they were built on stolen property." Her face went pale. Her hand clutched her pearl necklace, the same one she'd worn at the ribbon cutting. It snapped, scattering pearls across the dirt. And when the second condo began to fall, she fainted. The demolition continued with methodical precision. Jake's crew knew their work. They moved in synchronized rhythm, tearing down one structure after another, clearing debris, watering the dust to keep it from spreading. Every impact was an exclamation mark at the end of a sentence Jake had been writing for months. Boom, that's for forging my father's signature. Boom, that's for calling my warnings empty threats. Boom, that's for pretending ownership doesn't matter. By noon, half the development was rubble. The HOA office, the clubhouse, the swimming pool, all reduced to twisted metal and cracked stone. The camera crews circled closer, their microphones picking up every crash. News stations were already live streaming the event under headlines like, "Local man wins land battle, HOA condos demolished by court order. Justice served in Maple Ridge property scandal." Jake ignored them. He wasn't here for fame, he was here for closure. Still, one reporter, a young woman with dust in her hair, dared to approach. "Mr. Callahan," she shouted over the noise, "do you have any comment for the homeowners who just lost everything?" Jake paused. His eyes softened for a moment as he looked at the ruins. "Yeah," he said finally, voice steady. "I'm sorry they were lied to. They bought into a dream someone else built on stolen dirt. I didn't destroy their homes, the truth did. The reporter nodded slowly, her expression shifting from judgment to understanding. As the hours passed, the last standing structure, Building 6, loomed like a final monument to arrogance. It was the tallest, the newest, and the one Victoria had personally designed. Jake walked closer, boots crunching over the rubble. He ran his hand along a cracked pillar, reading the words etched into the concrete near the entrance. Built to last. He gave a small, humorless smile. Guess not. He turned to his foreman. Take it down. The man nodded. Engines roared again and the massive machine rolled forward. Its claw rose, swung, and punched through the base. Cracks raced up the wall like lightning bolts. With one final groan, the entire structure tilted, hesitated, then collapsed in on itself. Crash! A tidal wave of dust exploded outward. Reporters ducked, residents screamed, and even the sheriff raised his arm to shield his face. When the air cleared, only a mountain of debris remained. Jake stood there for a long moment, the court order flapping gently in his hand. His heart was steady, but his throat tightened. The sound of the collapse echoed long after the dust settled, like a ghost of the arrogance that had built it. He exhaled slowly. That's that. Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, the once busy development site was silent again. The bulldozers had stopped. The workers had gone home. The only thing left standing was a single wooden post with a metal sign attached to it. Jake walked over and brushed off the dust. It read, Parcel 47B22, Private Property, Callahan Land Holdings. He smiled faintly. Finally, the name was back where it belonged. He sat on the tailgate of his truck, watching the fatting orange light wash over the flattened land. It was strange. The emptiness looked peaceful, honest, like the ground itself could finally breathe again. He pulled out his father's old pocket knife, the one engraved with the initials JCSR, and stuck it into the dirt beside him. This is for you, Dad, he murmured. They thought they could bury our name. Guess I showed 'em. The sheriff approached quietly. Quite a sight, he said, nodding at the rubble. You sure you're done here? Jake looked out over the horizon. Yeah, the land's clean again. That's all I ever wanted. The sheriff smiled. Well, I'll be damned. Never seen someone win against an HOA. Jake chuckled softly. They never went up against a Callahan before. As night fell, floodlights cast long shadows over the demolished site. Dust still hung in the air, glowing gold under the beams. Jake climbed into his truck, started the engine, and looked in the rearview mirror one last time. Behind him lay the remains of greed, lies, and arrogance, crushed beneath the weight of truth. He drove off slowly, headlights cutting through the dust. And as he disappeared down the old dirt road, a gust of wind swept across the empty land, rustling through the scattered debris. Somewhere among the ruins, the broken sign of Maple Ridge Condominiums creaked on its hinges before finally toppling over. The echo of its fall was the last sound of the day, a quiet punctuation to the story of a man who took back what was his. Because in the end, they built dreams on stolen dirt, and Jake Callahan just leveled it back to the truth. The dust had barely settled when the headlines hit. By dawn the next morning, every news outlet in the county and half the state was running the same story under different names. The HOA collapse scandal. Maple Ridge condominiums built on stolen land. Local man demolishes illegal development after winning court battle. Jake Callahan's name was everywhere. His face, rugged, calm, caught mid-sentence in front of the wreckage, filled the news cycle. Some called him a hero, others called him a destroyer. But one thing was certain, everyone knew his story now. By noon, the county courthouse was swarmed with reporters. Microphones and cameras jutted out like bayonets as county officials held a press conference on the courthouse steps. District Attorney Miriam Stokes, a sharp woman with gray streaks in her hair, stood at the podium. Following an investigation into fraudulent documentation and illegal development, she began, the Maple Ridge Homeowners Association has been found guilty of multiple violations, including property fraud, forgery, and obstruction of public records. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Effective immediately, Stokes continued, the HOA is ordered to pay $8.2 million in fines and restitution. The former treasurer, Roger Telford, has been arrested on charges of forgery and conspiracy to defraud a property owner. Additional charges may follow pending federal review. The cameras flashed wildly. Reporters shouted questions, trying to out-yell one another. Is Mr. Callahan being compensated for damages? Will residents be refunded for their losses? Was the county complicit in approving the permits? Stokes raised a hand for silence. Mr. Callahan's ownership of the land is not in dispute. As of this morning, it has been fully restored under his name, officially and permanently. She paused. Justice in this case was not swift, but it was certain. A few blocks away, Jake watched the broadcast on the small TV in his lawyer's office. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. The satisfaction was quieter than that, deep and steady, like the hum of an old truck engine. His attorney, a young but sharp man named Elliot Brandt, turned off the television and leaned back. You did it, Jake. Not just for you, this'll set precedent. You realize that, right? Jake shrugged. I didn't do it for anyone else. Elliot grinned. Yeah, well, you did anyway. Half the county calling you a folk hero. Other half thinks you're the devil. Jake smirked faintly. Guess that's balance. Elliot chuckled, sliding a folder across the desk. Here, final deed certification. Parcel 47B22, officially yours again. Jake picked it up carefully, running a thumb over the embossed seal. His father's name had once been here, John Callahan SR. And now his own was printed beneath it. The legacy lived on. He nodded slowly. Let's make sure it stays that way. The HOA, meanwhile, was imploding from the inside. Victoria Lang resigned within 48 hours, citing emotional exhaustion. Reporters camped outside her gated home for days, but she refused to answer questions. When she finally appeared, her once perfect hair and posture were gone, replaced with a distant, hollow stare. I thought we were doing something good, she told one journalist quietly before slamming the door. Roger Telford, the corrupt treasurer, wasn't so lucky. He was led out of his office in handcuffs, the same hands that had forged Jake's father's signature now cuffed behind his back. As reporters surrounded him, he muttered, "It was just paperwork. Everyone signs off on things." His lawyer refused to comment. Weeks passed. The land once scarred by construction began to heal. Jake hired a small crew to clear the remaining debris and level the soil. Bulldozers were replaced by tractors, and the sound of hammers gave way to birds and wind. He installed a fenced, sturdy, weathered cedar with metal posts sunk deep into the ground. Along its edge, he hung a simple sign. Private property, Callahan Land Holdings. Established 1972, reclaimed 2025. No HOA banners, no marketing slogans, just truth. Each morning, Jake walked the perimeter with a cup of coffee, boots crunching on the gravel path. It was quiet now, the kind of quiet that only belonged to honest land. Sometimes he'd stop by the small oak tree near the center of the property, the same one he'd planted with his father when he was a boy. The fire of vengeance was gone now, replaced with something steadier, peace. The world, however, hadn't forgotten. Within a month, the HOA collapse scandal became a national talking point. Talk shows debated it. Legal podcasts dissected it. News anchors turned Jake's quote into a viral soundbite. They built dreams on stolen dirt. I just leveled it back to the truth. For weeks, journalists tried to reach him for interviews. Offers poured in: documentaries, book deals, even movie rights. Jake ignored them all. He didn't want fame, he wanted distance. One evening, a local news reporter caught up to him at the edge of the property. "Mr. Callahan," she said breathlessly, "after everything that's happened, the court battle, the demolition, the national attention, do you have any regrets?" Jake looked past her, toward the setting sun spilling gold across the reclaimed land. "Only one," he said quietly, "that it ever had to happen." Then he tipped his hat, turned, and walked back down the gravel road, his silhouette fading into the glow of twilight. Months later, the county placed a small bronze plaque on the edge of the property. It read, "Site of the Maple Ridge Scandal. In memory of lawful ownership, integrity, and the preservation of land rights. Truth stands when everything else falls. Jake Callahan." Locals came to see it sometimes. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others nodded in respect. But everyone who stopped there left knowing one thing: the land had taught a lesson no one would forget. On the first spring morning after the reclamation, Jake parked his truck by the oak tree again. The grass was greener now, soft and full. The air smelled clean, no dust, no concrete. He knelt down and pressed a hand into the soil. It was warm, solid, his. From his pocket, he pulled out the old photograph of his father again. The edges were worn now, but the smile was the same. Jake smiled back. "We're home again, Dad." He stood, looking over the open field where the condos once stood, now just a vast stretch of land kissed by sunlight. Birds circled overhead. The wind rustled through the fence line, carrying only one sound now: peace. The chaos was over. The fight was done. The land had been stolen, but the truth had taken it back. Jake turned toward his truck, a faint smirk tugging at his lips. "Funny thing about lies," he murmured, glancing once more at the reclaimed field. "They always collapse sooner or later." He climbed into his truck, started the engine, and drove off down the quiet road. The same road he and his father had once built together, plank by plank. Behind him, the land stretched wide and free, the morning sun glinting off the polished sign on the fence. Callahan Land Holdings, private property. This time, no one would ever question who it belonged to. Weeks had passed since the demolition, long enough for the last of the dust to settle, long enough for the noise to fade into memory. Where concrete once lay cracked and jagged, there was now open earth, fresh soil, wildflowers starting to take root along the edges. The air smelled different now, not of machinery or sweat or politics, but of rain, wood, and quiet renewal. Jake stood by his truck at dawn, a shovel in one hand, a small oak sapling in the other. The morning light stretched long across the field, painting everything gold. The land seemed to breathe again, like it had been holding its breath for years and finally exhaled. He looked over the empty space where the condos once stood, row after row of glass and arrogance. Now there was nothing but the hum of crickets and the faint rustle of wind through grass. It was perfect. Jake knelt down, pressing his fingers into the soil. The ground was soft, damp from the night's rain, good earth, the kind that gives life easily. He dug slowly, methodically, each shovel of dirt feeling like a heartbeat. This wasn't about revenge anymore. That had already burned away, leaving only something quieter: gratitude. He had brought a small wooden box with him. Inside was a folded photograph, his father in his younger years, standing in front of the old bridge they'd built together, smiling despite the mud on his boots. Jake placed the photo at the bottom of the hole before setting the oak sapling above it. "Guess this is yours now, old man," he said softly. "The land, the tree, all of it. You earned this more than anyone." He covered the roots gently, packing the soil down with his hands. When he was done, he stood back, breathing deeply. The sapling swayed in the wind, its leaves whispering faintly, as if answering. He smiled. "That's what I thought." Afterward, he walked to the truck bed and pulled out a small bronze plaque. It wasn't flashy, just simple metal, polished and honest. The words were engraved deep. In loving memory of John Callahan SR. He built more than fences and bridges. He built legacy. Truth stands when everything else falls. Jake ran a thumb over the inscription, feeling the grooves of each letter. Then, with slow precision, he fixed it to a small stone base at the foot of the tree. When he stepped back, the morning sun caught the plaque just right, glinting off the bronze. It looked timeless, like it had always been there. The birds began to sing, one, then two, then a whole chorus from the woods nearby. Their song filled the silence in a way no machinery ever could. Jake took off his hat and closed his eyes. The breeze was warm against his skin, carrying the faint scent of pine and soil. He remembered his father's words, words he hadn't thought about in years. A man doesn't own land just because his name, on paper, his father used to say. He owns it when he tends it, when he respects it. Jake smiled faintly. Guess I finally understand, Dad. For hours he stayed there. He fixed the fence line, straightened the posts, and cut the weeds that had started to creep in. Each task was quiet and deliberate, a rhythm of peace, not labor. At one point, a young couple from town stopped at the edge of the road. They recognized him instantly, the man from the news, the one who'd torn down the condos. The woman called out hesitantly, "Mr. Callahan." Jake turned, nodding. She smiled shyly. "We just wanted to say that was brave, what you did." Her partner added, "My parents lost their land to a development years ago. You gave people hope. Thank you." Jake nodded again, tipping his hat. "Wasn't about being brave," he said simply. "Was about being right." They smiled, waved, and left him to his work. By noon, the air had grown warm. Jake sat beneath the young oak, leaning against its slender trunk. He pulled a thermos from his bag, black coffee, still hot, and took a long sip. He watched the horizon stretch out before him, endless fields, winding creeks, distant trees, his land. Not as a trophy, not as revenge, but as a promise. From his pocket, he took a small compass, the one his father had given him when he was 12. The needle wavered for a moment before settling north. Jake chuckled softly. "Still points true." He placed it at the base of the tree beside the plaque, a quiet offering. As the day went on, the shadows lengthened. The sunlight turned orange, then deep amber. The oak tree shimmered in that golden hue, leaves flickering like tiny flames of life. Jake stood again, brushing dirt from his hands. He took one last look around at the fence, the fields, the sign that bore his family's name. Everything was finally in its place. Before leaving, he carved one last line into the back of the wooden fence post with his pocket knife. Small, simple letters that only someone standing close could read. He leveled lies and planted truth. He smiled at that, then walked slowly back to his truck. As he started the engine, a breeze swept across the field, bending the grass in waves. The young oak swayed gently, its leaves catching the fatting sunlight. In that moment, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. The land was alive again, the air was clean, the truth was rooted deep. Jake drove away as the sun sank low behind the trees. The dust rose briefly behind his truck, then settled softly back onto the earth, the same earth his father had once walked, now at peace. And as the wind moved through the field, it carried with it a sound faint, almost like a voice, a whisper only the land could make. If anyone had been close enough to hear, they might have caught it. "Welcome home." Days later, when passers-by drove along the county road, they'd see the oak tree standing proud and alone in the middle of the reclaimed field. Beneath it, the plaque gleamed in the sunlight. Birds perched on its branches, grass swayed around its base. And sometimes, in the quiet hours of the morning, locals swore they could see Jake's truck parked by the fence, engine off, window down, the man inside just watching. watching the land grow back to life. Because for Jake Callahan, the fight had never been about tearing something down. It was always about restoring what was lost and making sure it would never be stolen again.